Before I start my career in insurance fraud investigation, I spent 3 years inside the system, reviewing claims, catching patterns, building cases that put people in courtrooms. I was good at it. My supervisor used to say I could smell a lie through a spreadsheet. I didn't think that skill would ever matter in my personal life. I thought it was something I left at the office every evening when I drove home to my husband and our daughter. I was wrong. My daughter was 7 years old when her father looked me in the eye and told me our marriage was over. She was in the next room watching cartoons. I remember thinking how thin the walls were. I remember thinking she could probably hear everything. He didn't ask me to sit down. He just stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and said he wanted a divorce, that he'd been unhappy for years, and that his attorney had already drawn up the paperwork. He said it the way you'd tell someone their parking meter expired. Flat, rehearsed. I asked him what he meant by the paperwork. He slid a folder across the counter. He was keeping the house, both cars, the joint investment account we'd been building since before our daughter was born, the vacation property in the Smoky Mountains that I had inherited from my grandmother and transferred into our joint name because he said it made more sense for tax purposes. He said I could take my personal belongings and whatever was in my individual checking account, which at that point held about $4,000. He said he thought it was fair. I stood there looking at the folder and I thought about the word fair. I thought about the 8 years I'd spent cutting back my hours at work, then leaving my job entirely when our daughter got sick because someone needed to be at every specialist appointment and it wasn't going to be him. I thought about the mortgage payments I'd made from my savings before we got married, the down payment that came entirely from money I'd saved before we were ever a couple. I thought about my grandmother's cabin, which she'd left specifically to me, which still had her handwriting on the deed transfer letter in a box somewhere in our attic. I didn't say any of that. I picked up the folder. I said I'd look it over. He looked surprised. I think he expected me to cry. Or maybe to argue. Either would have given him something to push back against. Instead, I just took the folder and walked to the living room and sat down next to my daughter and watched the rest of her cartoon. That night, after she was asleep, I drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town and sat in a corner booth and read every page. He had done this carefully. His attorney, I recognized the firm name from billboards around the city, a well-known divorce practice, had structured the proposal to look equitable on paper while bearing the most important assets in language that most people would have to hire someone to decode. The vacation property was listed as a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. The investment account was presented at a value from 2 years ago, which I was fairly certain did not reflect its current balance. There was a note about business expenses that I didn't understand, referencing an LLC I had never heard of. He had told me he was a project manager at a mid-size construction company. We had filed joint taxes for 8 years. I thought I knew what he made. I drove home and didn't sleep. The next morning, I made my daughter breakfast and walked her to the school bus and came back inside and called my sister. She drove over from across town and sat at the kitchen table with me and said very little while I talked. At some point, she said, "You know you aptly know how to do this, right?" She meant the investigating. She meant that I was not a regular person trying to figure out what her husband had hidden. I was someone who had spent years doing exactly that for a living. I knew she was right. I just hadn't let myself think it yet. I didn't confront him. I didn't call an attorney that day. Instead, I did what I used to do when I picked up a suspicious claim file. I started at the beginning and looked for what didn't fit. The LLC was the first thing. It was registered in his name and a business partner's name, filed about 14 months earlier in a neighboring state. The registered agent address was a UPS store. The business purpose listed was consulting services. He had not mentioned it to me once. I pulled our last 3 years of joint tax returns from the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. He had always handled our taxes, always said it was simpler since most of the income was his. I had signed without looking closely. I looked closely now. There were deductions I didn't recognize. Travel expenses to cities he'd told me were work trips, but the dates didn't always match what I remembered. A home office deduction for a square footage that didn't make sense for the layout of our house. And on the most recent return, the investment account balance reported for informational purposes was significantly lower than what I remembered seeing when I logged in 2 years ago. Not dramatically lower. Lower in a way that could be explained as market fluctuation if you didn't look too carefully. But I looked carefully. I spent the evenings in that spare bedroom with the door closed, my daughter asleep down the hall, going through everything I could legally access. Our joint accounts, records that were in both our names, documents I had signed. I made copies of everything. I organized it into a single expandable folder with tabs, the way I used to organize case files. Then I called an attorney. She was a woman I found through a referral from a colleague of my sister's, a family law attorney who had a reputation for being methodical rather than aggressive. Her office was small and smelled like old coffee, and she had a habit of taking notes in the margins of her legal pad in a handwriting so small I couldn't read it from across the desk. I liked her immediately. I showed her everything I had. She was quiet for a while. Then she said that the LLC was worth investigating further. She said that the asset valuations in his proposal looked like they might have been deliberately depressed. She said that the vacation property almost certainly could not be classified as purely a marital asset if I could document that it came from an inheritance in my name and that the transfer had been made under certain representations. She told me not to confront him and not to move out of the house. I told her I had one more thing. I'd found something I hadn't shown her yet because I'd wanted to think about it first. When he filed the divorce paperwork, he had listed my income as zero since I had not been employed for 3 years. What I had also found in a file on our shared computer that he had apparently forgotten I had access to was a draft of a declaration he intended to submit to the court. In it, he described me as financially unstable, emotionally volatile, and an unreliable caregiver. He was planning to request primary custody of our daughter. He wanted to limit my time with her to every other weekend. The attorney set her pen down. I don't have a word for what I felt reading those words the first time. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder. He had looked at our daughter and calculated how to use her. I told the attorney I wanted everything. I wanted the house, primary custody, child support, and an accounting of every dollar that had moved through that LLC since it was formed. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Tell me again what you used to do for work." I told her. She smiled for the first time since I'd walked in. The next few months were the strangest of my life. I was living in the same house as a man I was now treating as a subject of investigation. I cooked dinner. I drove our daughter to soccer practice. I attended her parent-teacher conference alone because he had a last-minute work conflict, which I noted and added to the file I was building in a cloud folder. His name was not on. He seemed to believe I was compliant, that I had accepted the terms. He was friendlier than he had been in years, actually. Relaxed, like someone who had already decided how a game ends. Meanwhile, I was talking to my attorney twice a week. She had retained a forensic accountant to formally evaluate the investment account and the LLC's financial activity. I was asked to provide every document I had already copied. I did. I was also asked to provide anything showing the origin of the vacation property. I found the original deed transfer letter, my grandmother's handwritten note, and the estate paperwork from when I'd inherited the land. All of it documented the property passing to me by name before our marriage. The LLC, once the accountant dug in, told a story. Money had been moving through it in a pattern that looked, at least on the surface, like legitimate consulting income. But the invoices were being issued to a company that appeared to be owned in part by his business partner's wife. The payments corresponded almost exactly to dates when money disappeared from our joint investment account through what had been logged as administrative fees. It was not a sophisticated scheme. It was the kind of thing that works when no one is looking, when the person on the other side of the table doesn't know what to look for. I knew what to look for. There was also the matter of our daughter's health insurance. 6 weeks after he filed for divorce, I received a letter from our insurer that her coverage had been terminated. He had removed her from his employer-sponsored plan without notifying me and without obtaining replacement coverage. She had a follow-up cardiology appointment scheduled for the following month. She'd had a minor congenital heart issue identified when she was 3, managed and stable, but requiring annual monitoring. I paid the appointment out of pocket. I kept the receipt. I added it to the file. My attorney sent his attorney a formal notice that same week. She told me later that the response had been defensive in a way that suggested they hadn't expected me to catch it. I started to understand that he had built his entire strategy on a version of me that no longer existed. The version who left her career to take care of the house, who deferred to him on financial decisions, who signed documents without reading them closely. He was counting on that woman, walking into a courtroom. She wasn't. The hearing date was set for a Tuesday in March, which happened to fall during a week my daughter was staying with my sister. I wore a grey blazer I had bought specifically for that day. I had slept 6 hours the night before, which was more than I expected. His attorney was a man I recognized from those billboards. He was polished and tall and the kind of professionally confident that comes from winning a lot of uncomplicated cases. He looked at me when I came in the way people sometimes look at someone they don't consider a threat. The first portion of the hearing went the way his side expected it to. His attorney walked through the asset proposal. He characterized the investment account losses as market-related. He described the LLC as an unrelated business venture with no bearing on marital assets. He submitted his client's declaration about my stability and parenting capacity with the same flat efficiency you'd use to file a form. My attorney waited. When it was our turn, she submitted the forensic accountant's report first. It ran 47 pages. She asked the accountant who was present to walk through the key findings. He did, calmly and in plain language. The LLC had transferred approximately $63,000 in what the report characterized as funds that could not be documented as legitimate business expenses. The investment account had declined by an amount inconsistent with market performance during the same period. The variance was not explainable by the records provided. I watched his attorney's face while the accountant was speaking. He made a note on his legal pad. Then he made another note. Then he stopped making notes and just listened. My attorney then submitted the inheritance documentation for the vacation property. Original deed, estate paperwork, my grandmother's letter. She asked the court to remove it from the marital asset pool entirely. Then she submitted the insurance termination letter, the documentation of my daughter's medical history, and the out-of-pocket cardiology bill. She noted for the record that the termination had occurred 6 weeks into the divorce proceedings, that no replacement coverage had been arranged, and that the child had a documented ongoing medical condition. His attorney asked for a brief recess. During the recess, I sat in the hallway with my attorney and drank water from a paper cup and didn't say much. She told me he was likely going to propose a settlement. I asked what she thought we should ask for. She told me to let her handle it. When we went back in, his attorney made a revised proposal. The house to me, primary custody to me with generous visitation for him, child support at the statutory guideline amount, the vacation property removed from the marital estate, a partial settlement figure related to the investment account. My attorney declined. She made a counter. His attorney excused himself again. This time he was gone longer. I looked at my husband across the room while we waited. He was staring at the table. He had not looked at me once since the forensic accountant started speaking. The final agreement took another 40 minutes to negotiate. I got the house. I got primary custody, child support above the guideline amount, with a provision that he was required to maintain health insurance for our daughter as part of the order, and that any lapse would be treated as a contempt violation. The vacation property was returned to me entirely. There was a structured settlement for the investment account discrepancy, which his attorney insisted on characterizing as a reimbursement for accounting irregularities, rather than anything more specific. I didn't care what they called it. When it was over and the room had cleared, my attorney put her hand on my arm and said something that I think about sometimes. She said that most people in my position come in hoping for fair. She said I came in knowing what fair actually looked like. I drove to my sister's house to pick up my daughter. She had made a card for me that said, "Welcome home, Mommy," in purple marker, even though home had been hers and mine all along. I held it the whole drive back. There are things I've thought about since. Why I stayed as long as I did without looking more closely at the finances. Why I assumed that trust meant I didn't need to understand. I don't have a clean answer. I think I believed that keeping the peace was the same as being safe. I was wrong about that. What I know now is that the most important skill I've ever had was the one I thought I left at the office. The ability to look at a set of numbers and ask what's missing, to notice when a story doesn't quite add up, to not accept the version of events that someone hands you in a folder and calls fair. My daughter is 9 now. She asks questions about everything: why the sky changes color at sunset, why her teacher gives the same homework twice sometimes, why people say things they don't mean. I tell her the same thing every time. I tell her to keep asking. She will not be the kind of person who signs without reading. I'll make sure of that. I keep thinking about the folder, the way he slid it across the counter like it was nothing. Like 8 years and a daughter and a house I'd helped pay for could be summarized in a stack of papers and handed back to me as a final answer. What I've come to understand, slowly and not without some bitterness, is that he made a choice rooted in the assumption that I wouldn't look, that I'd see the legal language and feel overwhelmed and sign. That's not cruelty in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter and maybe more honest about who he decided I was. He looked at the woman who had left her career to take care of our child and concluded that she'd forgotten how to think for herself. He was wrong, but I understand why he thought it. There's a version of this story where I'm that woman, where I cry in the kitchen, call a friend, accept whatever the paperwork says is fair, and spend the next decade rebuilding from less than I deserved. I think about her sometimes. She's not weak. She just didn't know what I knew. And that's the thing that stays with me. Not the hearing, not the forensic report, not the moment his attorney went quiet. What stays with me is that the only thing standing between that version and this one was what I chose to do with what I already had. The skills I used weren't magic. They weren't revenge. They were just attention, applied carefully over time. The same attention I'd given to hundreds of insurance claims for other people finally turned toward my own life. I think there's something important in that. Not that I was special, but that I had refused to stop being the person I was before I became a wife and a mother. I had kept that part of myself intact even when everything else changed. That's the thing I most want my daughter to understand when she's old enough. You don't surrender the sharpest parts of yourself to make someone else comfortable. You keep them. You maintain them quietly. You hope you never need them. And if the day comes when you do, you are ready. What my husband built his plan on was a kind of moral laziness. The belief that he could take more than was his because the accounting would be too complicated for me to follow. People who operate that way tend to believe that what they can get away with is the same as what they deserve. It almost never holds. Not because the universe collects things on a schedule, but because the truth of what you've done lives in the numbers, in the documents, in the paper trail that doesn't care about your intentions. He moved money. The money left a record. The record told the story. That's not fate. That's just math. I am not the same person I was the morning he handed me that folder. I am harder in some places and softer in others. I understand now that trust is not the same as blindness, and that love is not a reason to stop paying attention. I also understand that walking into a room prepared is not the same as being cold. It is the most honest thing you can do for yourself and for the people who depend on you. My daughter will not be someone who signs without reading. I'll make sure of that.